In this video, we're going to review a non-parametric statistical procedure called the sign test. And this particular procedure is carried out when we have paired observations. So observations from cases that are measured twice. So there's a dependency between the two measures. And the sign test stems to some of the original work of John Arbuthnot, who examined birth rates in the city of London many years ago. And John Arbuthnot based his observations on something called the binomial distribution, and his work that examined what's called divine providence to explain the difference in birth rates between males and females was really the first recorded statistical test and served as the basis for what is known today as the sign test. And the term sign refers to the sign of the numerical value as to whether it is positive or negative. And the sign test essentially examines differences in pairs of data that are either a positive value or a negative value that would reflect higher or lower values across the pairs. The one limitation of the sign test is that it does not provide an indication of the magnitude differences, but just the differences between one set of the paired observations. And to illustrate the sign test, we're going to start with a research question, and that research question relates to the salaries of professional football players. And the question here is, do professional football players make too much money? Now, the research in question isn't on the football players per se, but on the perception of people in the general public as to whether they think professional football players make too much money. Now, to pose a research question like this, people would be required to answer yes or no, and that doesn't provide a great deal of precision. A better way to address this question is to not ask the question, but to make a statement that professional football players make too much money. And then examining people's perceptions of this using what's called a Likert scale. So here we have the scale that is typically used and modified to assess attitudes or the values of people. And so on this particular illustration, a statement would be provided and people would indicate a point along this line as to whether they agree with this statement, if they disagree with the statement, if they strongly agreed, which would be number one, strongly disagreed, or they were just neutral about it. And this is a way to quantify these types of measures in people. Now that sets up another question of how much money do professional athletes actually make. And so this is a little bit more of a challenge in terms of tracking down this information to get objective data. And so can this be obtained through Wikipedia? And the answer to that is no, because the information on Wikipedia may not be valid. Is this information obtained from the news? Perhaps, but usually the news reports salary information for the most highly paid professional athletes. So it certainly depends on the sport. So for example, in Canada, athletes in the Canadian Football League usually do not have their salaries released to the public. But a common website, sportscity.com, collects these data from the teams themselves and posts this information online. So what you're seeing here on the next two slides are the actual salaries, or the statistics of athletes' salaries over the course of 2014 and 2015 for the four major North American professional sports. And so to describe these salaries, we would use the average. And so what we're looking at here is Major League Baseball, the American League, and the National League. And when examining statistics, you always want to get an indication of the sample size from which these statistics were tabulated. And so what we see here is the average salary for professional baseball players in 2014 and 2015 is just over $4 million for that year, but the median salary is only 1.5 or 1.65 in the American and National Leagues respectively. That's the big difference between the mean and the median suggests to us that these salaries do not form a symmetrical or normal distribution. They're highly skewed. And that's reflected in the standard deviation. So you actually see a standard deviation value that's larger than the mean, indicating the wide range of salaries here. And so if we take a look at the very highest salaries, here we're looking at 28 and over $32 million, and the lowest salaries here are just under $500,000. And this pattern is observable for the other professional sports. So once again, as we saw with baseball, with football in the National Football League, we see that there's quite a bit of a discrepancy between the average and the median salary, very high standard deviation, and a very large range. And the fact that the mean and the median are so different from each other suggests that these data are highly skewed. And just to round out the four professional sports, very similar pattern here with professional basketball, with a big discrepancy between the mean and the median. Very large standard deviation in range, and the same thing with professional hockey, although the difference between the mean and the median not as great as we saw with some of the other sports, but once again very large standard deviation and a very large range. And if we were to describe all these four professional or the salaries of the four major professional North American sports using this bar graph, we see that the NBA players on average are paid to a much greater extent, more or less, than the other sports. And the error bars here indicate the variability in the salaries around the average, and these error bars are the standard deviations. So you can see very large standard deviations, particularly with baseball and basketball, not as high with the other sports, but still considerably large. And we can see here from these data that of the four North American sports, NBA players get paid on average the most as compared to baseball, football, and hockey. And the relation this has to the sign test goes back to our original question as to the perception of people in the general public related to professional athletes' salaries. And so in the next video, we're going to continue with the sign test and use that to examine how people's perceptions can possibly change with respect to athlete salaries following knowledge of these last few slides. So this will end this video, and then we'll pick up in the next one here where we actually will conduct the study.